The battlefield was a wasteland of fire, smoke, and broken machines. Explosions shook the ground, sending plumes of dust into the dark sky. The war between species had reached its peak, and now the once thriving valley was nothing but ash and ruins. Caleb Thorne, a human combat engineer, crouched behind a destroyed transport, gripping his battered rifle. His breathing was shallow, his mind sharp. He had been left behind when his unit retreated. Non-essential, they had called him. Caleb didn't care. He had survived wars like this before. Just keep moving, he muttered to himself. He glanced over the wreckage, scanning for enemies. The horizon burned, but amidst the chaos, Caleb spotted something unexpected, a figure fighting alone. A towering alien woman, clad in shattered silver armor, stood her ground in the middle of the field. Her long violet hair streamed like a banner of war as she swung a massive blade, cutting through enemy machines and soldiers alike. Her movements were precise, deadly, like a storm given form. "Who is that?" Caleb whispered, unable to look away. The alien warrior didn't falter, even as her wounds bulged and her armor sparked. It was clear she was losing ground, surrounded on all sides. The enemy moved like vultures, closing in for the kill. Caleb cursed under his breath. He didn't know her. She wasn't human. And yet, something about her refusal to surrender struck a chord deep in him. She deserved better than to die here alone. "Damn it," he growled, slinging his rifle onto his back. Before he could stop himself, Caleb broke into a sprint. He moved low and fast, weaving through rubble and bodies as bullets zipped past him. The alien warrior didn't notice him. She was too busy fending off the enemies circling her like wolves. Caleb slid behind a broken mech, pulling a small grenade from his belt. "Let's hope this still works." With a quick yank, he hurled the grenade into the cluster of enemies closest to the alien woman. Boom! The explosion lit up the battlefield, sending enemy soldiers flying. The alien warrior staggered back in surprise, her glowing golden eyes narrowing toward the smoke. That's when she saw him. Caleb, stepping out of cover, his rifle raised. "Hey!" Caleb shouted, waving to her. "Move, now." The warrior blinked, stunned for half a second, but she understood his command. With a roar, she charged forward, slashing through the confused enemy lines while Caleb laid down cover fire. Together, they carved a path through the chaos, the sounds of gunfire and roars echoing all around them. Caleb's rifle grew hot in his hands, but he didn't stop. Finally, they reached a burned-out trench on the far side of the field. Caleb dove in first, turning back to help her. The alien woman dropped down beside him, her massive frame towering over his. Her blade dripped with blackened enemy blood. For a long moment, neither spoke, their breaths heavy. Then the warrior turned to Caleb, her golden eyes piercing his. "You," she said, her voice deep and commanding. "You saved me." Caleb leaned back against the trench wall, grinning faintly despite the danger. "Well, you looked like you could use a hand." The warrior stared at him, her expression unreadable. "Who are you, human?" Caleb smirked. "Name's Caleb Thorne, and you're welcome." Caleb leaned back against the trench wall, sweat running down his face, his chest rising and falling. Beside him, the alien warrior woman crouched low, her massive sword resting across her armored legs. The glow of her golden eyes was impossible to ignore. For a moment, the battlefield felt distant, as though the war had paused to let them catch their breath. "You saved me," the warrior repeated, her voice deep but steady, as though she still couldn't believe it. Caleb shrugged, trying to keep things light. "Yeah, well, you looked like you were about to be overwhelmed. Couldn't let that happen." Her piercing gaze locked onto him. "Humans do not intervene for my kind." Caleb glanced sideways at her, his lips quirking into a faint grin. "Guess I'm not like most humans." The warrior tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. Up close, Caleb could see the fine patterns etched into her skin, glowing faintly like living energy. Her armor, though cracked and dented, was unlike anything he'd seen, a mix of ancient design and advanced technology. "What do I call you?" Caleb asked, breaking the silence. She hesitated, as though unused to such a simple question. Finally, she replied, "I am Syra of the Venari." "Syra," Caleb repeated, testing the name. "That's got a nice ring to it." Syra studied him for a moment longer before looking away, as if embarrassed by the compliment. Her sharp gaze turned toward the battlefield, now quieter, though smoke still rose in the distance. "We are not safe here. More will come." Caleb followed her gaze, his jaw tightening. "You're right. We need to move." Syra's brow furrowed. "You speak as if we are a team. Human." Caleb looked at her with a smirk. "Aren't we? I mean, I did save your life back there, and you cleared the path for us. I'd call that teamwork." Syra blinked at him, clearly thrown off. Caleb found it strangely satisfying to see someone so powerful look confused. "Do not mistake my gratitude for weakness," she said firmly. "I owe you a debt, but I do not follow humans." Caleb chuckled. "Fair enough. You don't have to follow me. But let's be clear, you're not exactly in great shape, and this war zone isn't going to clean itself up. So for now, sticking together seems smart." Syra glanced down at her damaged armor, a flicker of frustration in her golden eyes. Finally, she nodded. "Very well, Caleb Thorne. We move together, but I will not slow you." "Good deal," Caleb replied, pushing himself to his feet. "Now let's find somewhere safer than this trench before those drones come sniffing around." Syra rose with surprising grace for someone so large, her massive sword resting easily on her shoulder. She towered over Caleb, but he wasn't intimidated. Instead, he grinned. "Stick with me, Syra. I'll make sure you live to fight another day." Her gaze softened, just for a moment, before she looked away. "We shall see, human. We shall see." Together, they climbed out of the trench and disappeared into the smoke, two unlikely allies fighting to survive a war that neither of them could win alone. Caleb trudged through the smoldering remains of the battlefield, his rifle ready and eyes sharp. Syra walked beside him, her massive sword resting against her shoulder like it weighed nothing. Despite the dents in her armor and the bruises along her glowing skin, she moved with the grace of a predator. "You sure you're good to keep moving?" Caleb asked, glancing up at her towering form. Syra scoffed softly, not even turning to look at him. "You insult me, human. A Venari warrior does not falter." "Yeah, well, you nearly did back there," Caleb muttered under his breath, though he smirked to himself. Syra's pride reminded him of soldiers he'd served with, strong, stubborn, and always pushing their limits. They moved carefully, weaving between broken vehicles and shattered mechs that littered the landscape like giant tombstones. Smoke curled from the ground, and the air smelled of burnt metal and ozone. Caleb led the way, his instincts honed from years of surviving war zones. "Where are we going?" Syra asked finally, breaking the silence. Caleb glanced over his shoulder. "There's an old supply depot about 2 clicks west. Abandoned for years, but if we're lucky, it'll have shelter and rations. You need a place to rest, and I need time to come up with a plan." Syra frowned, golden eyes narrowing. "I do not require rest." Caleb stopped and turned to face her, eyebrows raised. "You're limping." Syra bristled, her grip tightening on her sword. "I am fine." "Sure you are," Caleb replied with a grin, unconvinced. "Look, you're tough. I'll give you that, but you're not invincible. If we don't patch you up, you'll be dead the next time something attacks us." Syra stared at him, clearly unused to anyone challenging her. For a moment, Caleb thought she might argue, but instead, she exhaled sharply. "Very well, human. We go to this depot." "Glad we're on the same page," Caleb said, resuming their path westward. They continued in silence until Scifi finally spoke again, her tone quieter this time. "You fight well, Caleb Thorne. Your kind is not known for such skill." Caleb smirked without looking back. Humans are full of surprises. Sarah tilted her head, studying him as they walked. "You saved me when others would have let me fall." "Why?" Caleb shrugged, keeping his eyes on the horizon. "Because no one deserves to die alone. Not even a Venari warrior." Zaira's gaze softened, her golden eyes lingering on him. "Strange. You are not like the others I have faced." "Take it as a compliment," Caleb replied with a grin. Suddenly, a low rumble shook the ground beneath them. Both froze, their instincts flaring. Caleb's grip tightened on his rifle as he scanned the area. "Something's coming," Zaira murmured, her voice deadly calm. "Yeah," Caleb said, his expression hardening. "And I don't think it's friendly." From the distance, the faint hum of engines grew louder, and shadows began to move over the hills. Caleb glanced at Zaira, his heart pounding. "Looks like we're about to get some company." Zaira grinned, lifting her massive sword as her golden eyes flared with light. "Then let them come." Caleb smirked, raising his rifle. "I like the way you think." Together, they turned to face the oncoming threat, two unlikely warriors ready to fight side by side. The ground vibrated under their feet as the hum of engines grew louder. Caleb tightened his grip on his rifle, his eyes darting to the horizon. 3 enemy assault drones hovered into view, their red lights blinking like hungry eyes. "Of course it's drones," Caleb muttered, his voice dry. Beside him, Zaira rolled her shoulders, her massive sword gleaming in the fading sunlight. "These machines are nothing," she growled, her golden eyes flaring with determination. "Let's not underestimate them," Caleb said, checking his rifle. "They've got firepower, and you're still banged up." Zaira shot him a glare. "I told you, I am fine." Before Caleb could argue, one of the drones unleashed a stream of plasma bolts, scorching the ground in front of them. "Move," Caleb shouted, diving behind a pile of shattered metal. Zaira didn't move to cover. Instead, she roared, charging straight at the drones with her sword raised high. Caleb gawked for half a second before cursing under his breath. "She's insane." The drones turned their weapons toward Zaira, firing rapid bolts of energy. She dodged with shocking speed, her powerful legs carrying her forward in bursts of motion. The ground exploded around her, but she was unrelenting, a force of nature. "Keep them distracted," Caleb yelled, raising his rifle and firing at the closest drone. The shots pinged against its armor, drawing its attention. "Come on, you ugly piece of junk. Look at me." The drone turned, its red lights locking onto Caleb. It fired, and Caleb ducked just in time, his heart pounding. "That's it. Keep your eyes on me." Zaira used the distraction. She leaped into the air, her sword flashing like lightning. With one powerful strike, she cleaved through the first drone, splitting it in two. The wreckage hit the ground with a deafening crash. "That's one," Caleb called out, grinning. The remaining 2 drones focused on Zaira, their weapons heating up. Caleb could see she was fast, but she was tiring. The damage to her armor was slowing her down. "Not happening," Caleb muttered, pulling a grenade from his belt. He armed it quickly and hurled it at the closest drone. Boom! The explosion rocked the air, sending the second drone spinning before it crashed to the ground. Zaira didn't hesitate. She ran forward and drove her sword through the drone's core, ending it in a shower of sparks. The final drone hovered back, its targeting system hesitating as it reassessed the threat. Caleb lined up his rifle, steadying his aim. "Zaira, get down." She dropped just as Caleb fired a clean shot. The bullet hit the drone's power module, and the machine erupted in a fiery blast. For a moment, the battlefield went quiet. Smoke drifted from the wreckage, and Caleb exhaled sharply, lowering his rifle. Well, that wasn't so bad. Zyra stood, pulling her sword from the broken drone. She turned to Caleb, her golden eyes blazing. You fight well, for a human. Caleb grinned, wiping sweat from his brow. And you're not so bad yourself. Her fierce expression softening slightly. Perhaps you are not as weak as I thought. Caleb chuckled, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. I'll take that as a compliment. Now let's get to that depot before more of those things show up. Zyra nodded, and together they disappeared into the shadows. Two warriors who had proven that strength wasn't about species, it was about heart. The old supply depot came into view just as darkness began to swallow the sky. It was a crumbling structure, covered in vines and rust, but it was still standing. Caleb's boots crunched against the gravel as he approached cautiously, his rifle ready. Beside him, Zyra strode forward, her massive sword resting against her shoulder like it belonged there. That's the place, Caleb said, nodding toward the building. It's not pretty, but it'll keep us safe for the night. Zyra surveyed the structure, her glowing golden eyes narrowing. Are you certain this is safe? Caleb snorted, smirking. Safe. Not a word I'd use for anything on this planet, but it's better than being out here. Zyra grunted in agreement, and the two entered the depot. Inside, the air was stale, and the place looked abandoned for years. Dust settled on broken shelves, and the faint hum of wind whistled through cracks in the walls. Caleb swept the room with his flashlight, checking every shadow. Clear, he said finally, lowering his rifle. Zyra sank onto a rusted crate with a groan of exhaustion, placing her sword carefully against the wall. Caleb glanced at her, noticing the way she favored one side. You're hurt, he said, frowning. I am fine. Zyra shot back, though her voice lacked its usual strength. Caleb ignored her protest. He set down his bag and pulled out a medkit. You're really bad at lying, he muttered, kneeling beside her. Let me take a look. Zyra stared at him, her golden eyes unreadable. You presume too much, human. Yeah, well, someone has to keep you alive, Caleb replied, unfazed. He gently pushed aside a cracked piece of her armor, revealing a deep gash across her ribs. Blood, glowing faintly silver, had soaked the area. Caleb's brows furrowed. You've been fighting like this. Zyra didn't answer. Her pride wouldn't let her admit weakness. Caleb shook his head, pulling out antiseptic gel. This will sting, but it'll help. Zyra tensed as he applied the gel, her jaw clenching, but she didn't pull away. For someone so fierce, Caleb thought, she was surprisingly silent when it came to pain. Why do you care so much? She asked suddenly, her voice softer this time. Caleb paused, looking up at her. Because you're not just some warrior to me, Zyra. You're a person. And I don't let people die if I can help it. Her golden eyes softened slightly, as if those words had chipped away at some invisible wall. You're strange, Caleb Thorne, she murmured. Caleb smiled faintly. I've been told that before. When he finished bandaging her, he sat back against the wall, letting out a long breath. Outside, the wind howled, but the depot remained still. Zyra looked at him for a long moment before speaking again. You saved me. Twice now. That is not something I can ignore. Caleb looked up at her, raising an eyebrow. Well, you can pay me back by not dying on me. Zyra smirked, her strength returning to her voice. I do not die so easily, human. Caleb chuckled softly, shaking his head. Good. I'd hate to lose my only teammate. For the first time, Zyra smiled, just barely, and for the first time in years, she felt something other than war. She felt hope. The wind howled outside the depot, rattling the broken windows. Caleb sat on the cold floor, staring at the weak glow of his small lantern. Across from him, Zyra leaned back against the wall, her massive sword resting beside her. Despite her injuries, she looked more at ease now, calmer, almost peaceful. You're quiet, Caleb said, breaking the silence. Zira opened her golden eyes, their faint glow piercing the dim light. I am thinking, human. Caleb smirked. About what? How I'm the most annoying person you've met. Her lips twitched, almost forming a smile. No, she replied. About you. Caleb raised an eyebrow. Me? What about me? Zyra's gaze lingered on him for a moment before she spoke. You are unlike any human I have faced. Your kind brings destruction, yet you bring mercy. Caleb sighed, leaning his head back against the wall. Not all of us are bad. Most of us are just trying to survive, like you. Zyra frowned faintly. Survival is not enough. I fight for honor, for my people. It is my purpose. And how's that working out for you? Caleb asked, his voice gentle but pointed. Zyra stiffened slightly, her golden eyes narrowing. I do what I must. Caleb tilted his head toward her, his voice softer now. And yet, here you are, alone, bleeding, in a crumbling depot with a random human. For a moment, Zyra said nothing. Her pride kept her silent, but Caleb's words struck deeper than she cared to admit. Finally, she let out a long breath. The Venari do not retreat. To fight and die is our way. Caleb shook his head, a small smile on his lips. Sounds lonely to me. Zyra blinked, surprised. Lonely? Yeah, Caleb said. Honor's great and all, but what good is it if you don't have anyone left to share it with? Zyra stared at him, her expression unreadable. She had spent her entire life believing that strength and honor were everything, that weakness was unforgivable. Yet here was a human, someone her people called weak, challenging everything she had been taught. Before she could answer, a faint noise echoed outside. Caleb tensed immediately, his hand snapping to his rifle. Zyra's sharp senses caught it too. Footsteps, distant but deliberate. Someone's coming, Caleb muttered. Zyra gripped her sword, her strength returning despite the pain. Enemies. Caleb cursed under his breath, moving toward the window to peek outside. Through the haze, he saw dark figures moving through the ruins. Patrol soldiers, armed and searching. We've got to move, Caleb said, turning back to her. Zyra stood, her massive frame towering over him as she lifted her sword. Let them come. I will deal with them. Caleb frowned. You're still hurt. We need to get out of here, not fight. Zyra looked down at him, her golden eyes blazing. And leave you to face them alone. No. Caleb sighed, a mix of frustration and admiration in his expression. You're stubborn, you know that. Zyra smirked faintly. And you are brave, Caleb Thorne. Perhaps too brave for your own good. Caleb checked his rifle one last time. Fine. Then let's give them something to regret. Zyra nodded, her sword gleaming as she prepared for the fight. Together, the human and the Venari warrior stood side by side, ready to face the oncoming enemy. In that moment, Caleb realized something. She wasn't just a warrior. She was his ally, and maybe even his friend. The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, echoing through the ruins like a drumbeat of danger. Caleb checked his rifle one last time, his heart racing. They're close, he muttered. Zyra stood beside him, her massive sword gleaming faintly in the moonlight. Her glowing golden eyes scanned the darkness, sharp and focused. Despite her injuries, she looked like a warrior born for this moment. You do not need to fight, human, Zyra said suddenly, her voice low. I will face them alone. Caleb shot her a look. Not a chance. I'm not leaving you to get yourself killed. Zyra tilted her head, surprised by his tone. Why risk yourself for me? Caleb's lips curled into a faint smile. Because that's what you do for teammates, Zyra. You fight together. For a second, Zyra's gaze softened. She didn't answer, but the faint flicker of respect in her eyes said more than words could. The first enemy soldier emerged from the shadows, his weapon raised. Caleb fired first, his rifle crackling as the shot hit its mark. The soldier crumpled to the ground, and chaos erupted. More enemies poured in, their voices shouting commands. Plasma bolts lit up the ruins, streaking through the air like deadly comets. Caleb ducked behind a broken pillar, firing back whenever he saw a clear shot. Zara didn't hide. She was a force of nature. With a fierce war cry, she charged into the middle of the fight, her massive sword slicing through enemies with brutal precision. Her movements were fast and fluid, her injuries forgotten as adrenaline surged through her veins. Caleb peeked out from cover and couldn't help but stare in awe. Zara moved like a storm, unstoppable, fierce, and fearless. "Show off," he muttered with a grin, taking down another soldier. "Focus, Caleb Thorne," Zara shouted, her voice carrying over the sounds of battle. "I am focused," he shouted back, ducking as a plasma bolt narrowly missed his head. Together, they fought as one. Caleb picked off enemies from a distance while Zara cleared the battlefield up close. The soldiers didn't stand a chance. Zara's blade struck down anyone who dared get close, and Caleb's sharpshooting kept the rest at bay. But the fight wasn't easy. Zara staggered briefly, a plasma shot grazing her arm. Caleb's heart jumped. "Zara, I am fine," she roared, driving her sword into the last soldier with a final, echoing cry. Silence fell. The battlefield was still again, the bodies of the patrol scattered across the ruins. Caleb stepped out of cover, breathing heavily, his rifle still smoking. Zara stood in the middle of the chaos, her chest heaving, her golden eyes glowing brighter than ever. She turned to Caleb, her expression fierce but proud. "You fought well, human," she said. "Perhaps I misjudged your kind." Caleb grinned, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. "And you're not so bad yourself, Zara. Just remind me never to make you mad." Zara smirked faintly, her glowing eyes softening. "You are stronger than I thought, and braver than most." Caleb met her gaze, something unspoken passing between them. A bond forged in battle, stronger than words. "Come on," Caleb said, offering her his hand. "Let's get out of here before more show up." Zara hesitated for only a second before taking his hand. "Yes, Caleb Thorne," she said quietly. "Let us go, together."